Hey everybody, so today I'm going to show you guys how I approach painting a mountain scene. So the first thing that I do is try to figure out where my lines are going to go. So I just kind of very lightly sketch out the design that I want. So since this is more vertical, what I'm going to do is roughly split the canvas up into 3 sections. You can use a ruler. I normally just eyeball it though. So I'm gonna want my mountain starting roughly a third of the way, or 2/3 of the way up. So I'm just gonna very lightly put a line there to indicate that's where my mountains are gonna start at the top of them. Now where they're gonna end is another third down roughly. So I'm gonna put another line. This one's gonna be try to keep this line pretty straight, as that's going to be the horizon line. Okay, so now I want my focal point where the river recedes into the distance. So I don't want that to be straight down the middle. Compositionally, you normally don't put stuff in the middle. So I'm going to go over a little bit and place it about right here. Okay, so now I'm going to lightly mark out how I want the river to flow through this scene. So I'm just kind of making this up, making it kind of windy. I think something like that's gonna be good. So I know I'm gonna put a tree about right here, so I'm just gonna lightly mark that. And then I'm gonna pop in where my most prominent tree lines gonna go. So something like that. So this is just very rough sketch. It won't even show up on camera, but it's very light. But this is just to give me an idea of where I want to place everything. Okay, so whenever I paint a scene like this, I normally start with the sky. So the only colors that I have out right now for the sky is titanium white and cobalt blue. You can use any kind of light blue you have. And for today, my palette is just a piece of wax paper taped to a piece of glass, so very high tech here. Now, you only need a tiny bit of blue in comparison to the white. The sky's not going to be super dark, it's just gonna be a standard blue sky, put some clouds in later maybe. So getting something like that, a light blue, and just putting that down. So I'm just using a flat brush, a pretty large flat brush, and just painting that on. Nothing fancy here, just using back and forth strokes like this. What I'm going to do is go in with more white and mix up a lighter blue, this very, very pale blue. So the way that we see the sky, when it gets closer to the horizon, it's often lighter in color. So to give the illusion of this in our painting, I'm going to take that lighter color. It almost looks like pure white, but there is some blue in there. And I'm just going to feather that up. Blend that up by using like crisscross strokes, just like this. And this is a pretty subtle change in color. So I'm going to do some more white and make it a bit more dramatic. Okay, so in order to kind of make this transition even more noticeable, I'm going to darken the top of the sky a bit more. So I'm going to take more of that blue and kind of blend it with the colors that I already have on the palette. Just darken it up and feather that in on the top of the sky. Now my paint is still wet on my canvas. It's starting to get a little bit tacky, which means that it is drying, so I kind of have to move fast at this stage if I want to get those nice even blends. Because I'm using acrylic paints and they dry pretty fast, it can be tricky to blend them as they dry. So, not rushing, but just not taking my time. Okay, so now we're ready to get into the mountains. What I want to do is mix up a color that is just slightly darker than this pale blue at the bottom. So I'm just going to use that same blue that I had from earlier. And this that I'm painting now is going to be the mountains that are the farthest in the distance. So they're going to be really light, and they're almost going to fade into the sky. And I have switched to a smaller flat brush for this. But you can also use the same one that you used for the sky, that's no problem. So I'm just making mountain shapes. I'm kind of blending that out. A lot of these distant mountains are going to be covered up by the mountains that are closer, so I'm not worried too much about getting them perfect. They're just there to provide a sense of depth for our painting. So I think that's going to be good for the farthest away mountain. So now, as we bring the mountains closer to us, the viewer, we're going to add more saturation. So I'm going to add a bit more blue and just a little tiny bit of red. I'm going to avoid the yellow for now because yellow has a tendency to bring things a lot closer. So we're going to save that for our most close mountains, our closest mountains. So add just a little bit more. Basically, I'm mixing up a very blue purple, very blue light purple. Just the tiniest bit of red in there. And I'm gonna make this painting a bit more interesting by varying my shapes and having those shapes cut through one another. So covering up that distant mountain with a mountain that is a bit closer. Once again, that's just gonna push the depth and really sell this painting as something being semi-realistic. I'm gonna get more blue, make it more saturated, a little darker as we come forward. A little more red, and I'm gonna introduce just a little tiny bit of yellow. Truly just a little bit goes a long way when it comes to achieving depth in paintings. So I think I want this mountain that's here to kind of cut down like this, so a bit more dramatic. So I think I want my shapes to be more dramatic. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut through this mountain and create a peak right here. Okay, so I think that's pretty good for this next mountain. So we're just going to continue on moving these mountains closer. And how we're going to do that is just, once again, we're going to increase the saturation, which means it's going to be less gray. It's going to be maybe a little less white in the mix. And also we're going to just very slowly increase the amount of yellow we add into the mix. Okay, so for our last mountain, I want to add one that's just lives in here somewhere. So this is going to be same blue. I added way too much red. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to a new spot. A little more yellow. And then you can always just test out and see how your colors look. I think that's way too red. I think it needs more blue. So what I have right now is pretty dark, so I'm just going in with some white to lighten it up. We'll test that out and see how it looks. I think it needs to have more yellow. So I think that's pretty good. Because this mountain, this small hill, it's going to have more detail, I typically will go darker and then I'll add just a little bit of a lighter color on top to kind of indicate some more detail. Using this same mixture, I'm just going to add a little bit of white and a little tiny bit of yellow to make a lighter color of that. And then I'm just going to go in, sit with my same flat brush that I've been using this whole time. And I imagine that the light is going to come this way. So the sun's over here, and so it's going to shine this way and cast light on this side of the mountains. And while this paint is still wet, because I just applied it, I'm just blending it to make it very, very subtle. Because we don't want a lot of detail right here in this mountain, because it's still pretty far away from us. We're going to save the detail for as we get closer up here towards the foreground. So onto the tree line, I've introduced some phthalo blue, any kind of dark blue, because we are going to start darkening this up as we come forward. So far we've been working pretty light since we've been doing those distant mountains, but now we're doing a tree line that cuts into those mountains. So phthalo blue, some of that red, yellow. I'll just test this out. I think that's pretty good. So how I approach moving things forward, as they start to get more detail, I'll start blocking in. So what that means is I'll just add the base color. I'm not going to add any kind of detail at first. I'll hold off on that until another go around, another pass. So I'm going to start with a fairly dark color. I think that'll be better, yeah. And so we have our line, our horizon line is going to be about here. So I'm going to make that pretty straight across. And what I'm going to do, because once again, I'm not going to add any kind of detail yet, I'm just going to do random marks like this to put where the top of the trees are approximately going to go. I'm just dabbing on the paint. And smoothing it out. Okay, so this is the tree line all blocked in. Now before I add detail, I need this to dry. So I'm going to move on to blocking in the grass. That's going to be up here in the foreground. So because this is going to be pretty close to us, it's going to be fairly yellow. Gonna add more yellow to that mixture, the same tree mixture we had, and then some white too, and just try that out. That might be good for the darkest color, but I think it needs to be lighter, because this is a fairly bright scene that we're painting. So because this is the block in, I don't have to get the color exactly the way I want it. I'm also just using a very thin layer of paint. I've wet my brush just a little bit with water just to make that paint go a bit further. Okay, so now I'm going to wait for everything to dry, and then I'll come back when it's dry. Okay, so using some yellow, bit of phthalo blue, and some red. Makes a pretty dark color. So I'm going to add a little bit more red, because I think it's too blue. So that red kind of cancels out that blue. There we go, that's pretty good. So I'm just using a fairly large round brush, and I'm just giving the indication of shadows at this point. So I'm really just making random marks with my brush. Okay, so now that I have some of the darkest darks that I'm gonna get for those trees, I'm gonna add a little more yellow and just kind of try to soften up those transitions, those edges between where I put that darker paint and the paint I had on for the block-in stage. Okay, so I think that's gonna do it. So now I'm gonna mix up more of a mid-tone, so adding quite a bit of yellow, and this time instead of using that phthalo blue, I'm going to use that cobalt blue that we had originally that we used for the sky. A little bit of red. See how that does. So I'm keeping in mind that the sun's coming from the left side, so it's going to hit these trees and illuminate these trees on the left. And this is not my highlight color yet, this is just somewhere in between the highlight and the darkest. It's more of a transitional color. I'm also thinking I kind of want to raise the tree line a little bit to cover more of that mountain behind it. So this is the color that I'm going to use to do that. And once again, these marks that I'm making are I'm just basically dabbing on the paint. Okay, so now I think I'm ready for the highlight color. So I'm gonna use the same color I have mixed as a base. Take some white and a little bit more yellow. And I'm just using the very tip of my brush to dab on this paint, trying to give the illusion of clumps of leaves that are catching the sun that's coming from the left. And this is not the final highlight color, this is just a highlight color. So I'll probably do one more pass with an even lighter color. And so what I'm doing is I'm just picking out tree forms that I want to create. So not individual trees, because these are all kind of clumped together, but just giving that indication that there are individual trees in this clump of trees. And one of the ways I'm doing that is by bringing the highlight color all the way down to where the grass is. Okay, so I think this is pretty good so far. I'm gonna go in with what is probably gonna be my lightest highlight color, so just a little more yellow and more white. Once again, just using the tip of my brush, dabbing it on, like so. Okay, so finally what I'm going to do for these trees is kind of ease the transitions between the dark spaces and the light spaces. So I've washed off my brush. How I'm going to make this transition color is essentially a gray. So I'm going to take some blue, it's going to be a bluish gray, kind of mix that in with the highlight color I have. Add a little bit of red. We'll try that on for size. I think it needs to be a little more blue. So in the shadows, I'm just going to apply this color. Because even within shadows, there's still dimension. There's still different tones that you can see. So I'm just using this color and lightly going into those shadow areas to make it a bit more interesting and a little bit more detailed. Okay, so now we're going to move back into the foreground area. We're going to start working on the river. So I'm going to take a little bit of cobalt blue and some white. I'm essentially going to make a slightly darker version of our sky color. I'm just going to put that on. so now for the grass, I'm going to do what will hopefully be the final layer. I'm going to take yellow and white and add a little bit of the cobalt blue. And I'm back to my flat brush here, and what I'm going to do, instead of doing horizontal strokes, I'm going to do vertical. And a little more yellow. Okay, so now we're going to add some subtle shadows to the riverbank. So I'm going to take a darker color, start with some blue and some yellow, a little bit of red. Basically, where the water meets this bank, that's where it's going to be the darkest. Okay, so now I've finished darkening up some areas along the riverbank. So the next step is to add in some trees. So I'm going to mix a very dark green to start with. And to initially do these trees, I'm just using a small round brush. And to make my dark green, I'm using phthalo blue, some yellow, and a little bit of red. Okay, so I'm going to start on the left side, and I'm just going to use the tip of the brush to make a line down like this. Okay, and so because these are going to be like cedar trees, starting at the top, I'm going to make just little dabbing motions, and as I go down, I'm going to widen it. Okay, so I'm going to do another tree on this side, slightly smaller, because I want it to look like it's back behind this one. So I'm going to end it about right here, whereas this one ends over here. But it's the same thing, starting at the top, I'm just making little dots, making it wider as we go. Okay, since that was some of the darkest color, I'm going to go in and make a transitional color, or mid-tone, by using more yellow, a little bit of white, and a little bit of that lighter blue. I'm going to add a little bit more red. And then using the same dabbing motions, I'm gonna apply this mostly to the left side of the trees since that's where the sun is coming. Okay, now I'm gonna make this color lighter by adding more yellow and more white. We're gonna start doing more of the highlight color. Okay, now we're going to make it even lighter color and do what will probably be the final highlight. I like to build my way up to the highlights like this. Okay, so now that our highlights are done, I'm going to make a transitional color for these darker areas. So I'm going to use essentially the same dark color, but add more of the cobalt blue, maybe just a little bit of white too. Okay, so I'm going to use that same color and do the shadows for the trees. Okay, so now we're going to do the grass reflections in the river. So I'm going to use that same color, maybe make it a little more yellow and a little more bright. And I'm just going to do downward strokes like this. This is going to give the indication that the grass is casting a reflection onto the river below. I'm using a very thin layer of paint for this. And very light strokes. Try not to be too heavy-handed with it. So now I'm using a darker green and just re-establishing this line where the riverbank meets the river. Okay, so now I'm going to let that dry and we're going to do some birds up in the sky. So for the birds, I'm going to mix up a grayish color using blue, red, and a little bit of yellow. And I'm using a very small detail brush and just adding in the indication of birds. So I'm essentially just going to make a V. Okay, so to finish off this painting, we're gonna do the reflections of the water. So using white and just a little tiny bit of our cobalt blue. And you can wet your brush brush with water, just a little bit to kind of help this go on. So I'm using a flat brush and I'm just going to make horizontal strokes with this color. Cutting into that green of the reflection. And there we have it, a nice little mountain scene done in acrylic paints. I really like how this scene turned out, and I hope you guys enjoyed watching this. If you decide to recreate this painting, please be sure to tag me on Instagram at sarahcatherine.art.